May 18th, 1190. The ancient city of Iconium in Anatolia, an aging German emperor 70 years old, stands before what may be the largest Muslim army ever assembled against the Crusaders. His own force, battered by months of brutal marching, faces impossible odds. 40,000 Turkish warriors versus barely 15,000 exhausted Christians. The Turkish Sultan has sworn to wipe them from the earth. By sunset, one of the most devastating military victories in medieval history will be complete. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. This wasn't some young warrior in his prime. This was Frederick Barbarossa, a man who should have been warming himself by a fire in Germany, instead charging headlong into an army nearly 3 times his size. What happened in those fevered hours would shock the medieval world and send tremors through the Islamic kingdoms. This is the story of how an empire's pride met an emperor's iron will, and how one brutal day changed the course of the Third Crusade before it even reached the Holy Land. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear defies everything you think you know about medieval warfare. To understand how we arrived at this moment, we need to go back 3 years earlier, to October 1187, when news reached Europe that would shake Christendom to its core. Jerusalem had fallen. Saladin, the brilliant Kurdish general who had unified Egypt and Syria under his banner, had accomplished what seemed impossible. After nearly 90 years of Christian rule, the holy city was once again in Muslim hands. The defeat at the Horns of Hattin had been catastrophic. The kingdom of Jerusalem lay in ruins. Knights who survived told stories of watching their brothers cut down under the merciless sun, of King Guy of Lusignan led away in chains, of Saladin personally beheading Reynald of Chatillon for his years of breaking truces and raiding Muslim caravans. Chronicler wrote, "The streets of Acre ran with blood. Women threw themselves from towers rather than face capture. We had thought ourselves the righteous army of God, but God had turned his face from us." When Pope Urban III heard the news, he reportedly died of shock. His successor, Gregory VIII, immediately called for a new crusade. But this time, it wouldn't be led by minor nobles and ambitious second sons. This time, the kings themselves would march. Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Europe. Frederick was already a legend. His very name, Barbarossa, meant red beard in Italian, a reference to the distinctive russet beard that had turned white with age but still commanded respect. He had ruled for 38 years, longer than most men lived. He had fought the rebellious German princes, the independent Italian cities, the Pope himself. He had been on crusade before, back in 1147, as a young man accompanying his uncle Conrad III. That second crusade had been a disaster, a humiliating march through Anatolia where Turkish mounted archers had harried them every step, where starvation and disease had killed more men than battle. Frederick remembered those lessons. He had sworn then that if he ever led an army east, he would do it differently. Now, at 70, an age when most medieval men were long dead, Frederick saw one final chance for glory, one last crusade. His wife, Beatrice of Burgundy, had died the year before. His sons were grown, his empire stable. A man who had spent his life fighting for earthly power could now fight for his eternal soul. But Frederick Barbarossa was no simple pilgrim. When he took the cross in March 1188, he didn't just gather a few hundred knights. He assembled the largest and most professional army any crusade had ever seen. Chroniclers put the number at anywhere from 15,000 to 100,000. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, perhaps 20 to 30,000 fighting men at the start, with another 20,000 support personnel, camp followers and pilgrims. Frederick spent a year preparing. He sent embassies to every kingdom his army would pass through, demanding safe passage and supplies. He negotiated with the Byzantine Emperor Isaac Angelus in Constantinople. He even sent envoys to Saladin himself, not to negotiate but to warn him the Red Emperor was coming. One of Frederick's letters to Saladin survives, and its tone is remarkable. "We have heard of your conquest of the Holy Land. Know that we come not as petitioners but as the sword of God." "Prepare yourself, for we shall not stop until Jerusalem is restored or we are dead." The German army departed on May 11, 1189 from Regensburg. It was the most organized crusading force yet assembled. Frederick had learned from past disasters. He divided his army into disciplined units, each under proven commanders. His son, Frederick of Swabia, led the vanguard. Other contingents were commanded by Leopold of Austria, Hermann of Thuringia, and Berthold of Vohburg. These weren't glory-seeking young knights, but experienced warriors who understood discipline and logistics. The army marched along the old Roman roads through Hungary, then turned south toward the Byzantine Empire. At every stop, Frederick enforced strict discipline. Looters were hanged. The army paid for supplies rather than stealing them. This wasn't just morality, it was strategy. Frederick knew that living off the land would slow them down and turn potential allies into enemies. But problems emerged almost immediately with the Byzantines. Emperor Isaac Angelus, facing Turkish pressure on his own borders and suspicious of Western intentions, vacillated between cooperation and obstruction. At some points, Byzantine officials provided markets and guides. At others, they closed cities against the Germans, refused supplies, and spread rumors that Frederick intended to conquer Constantinople itself. The tension came to a head when Byzantine troops ambushed German foragers and arrested Frederick's envoys. Frederick, never a patient man, responded by threatening to take Constantinople by force. He even wrote to his son Henry in Germany, telling him to prepare a fleet to attack the Byzantine capital. Only direct intervention by the Serbian ruler, Stefan Nemanja, who offered his own lands as a supply base, prevented open war between the Germans and Greeks. One German knight wrote in his chronicle, "We had come to free Jerusalem from the infidel, but found ourselves fighting Christians who should have been our brothers. Every day lost to Byzantine treachery was a day our brothers in Utrema suffered." By the winter of 1189 to 1190, Frederick's army crossed into Anatolia, the vast plateau that forms the heart of modern Turkey. This was enemy territory. The Sultanate of Rum, ruled by Kilij Arslan II, controlled most of central Anatolia. The Turks were masters of the region's harsh geography, its scorching summers and frozen winters, its lack of water and forage. They were superb horsemen, experts at the devastating tactic of the feigned retreat, where they would pretend to flee, then wheel around to shower pursuing knights with arrows. Frederick knew this. He had faced it before, 43 years earlier, so he adapted. Rather than allowing his knights to charge wildly after Turkish raiders, he kept his forces compact, his supply train protected, his scouts numerous. He marched his army in a tight formation with heavy infantry on the flanks and archers interspersed among the knights. When Turkish horse archers appeared on the ridges, as they did almost daily, Frederick refused to be baited. His men endured the arrows, maintained formation, and kept marching. It was brutal. The heat of the Anatolian summer was still months away, but the spring sun was already fierce. Water was scarce. The Turks poisoned wells and burned villages before the Germans could reach them. Men began to fall from exhaustion. Horses died by the hundreds. The German chroniclers describe desperate scenes, soldiers drinking their own urine, cutting the throats of horses to drink the blood, collapsing on the march. But Frederick drove them forward. His personal example was everything. At 70, he marched on foot with his men when the terrain was rough. He shared their rations. When Turkish arrows fell, he stood in the open, daring them to strike an emperor. His men worshipped him for it. One chronicler recorded a soldier saying, "Our emperor is old in years but young in vigor. When I see him standing before us, I believe we can defeat the devil himself." The Turks watched this German army with growing concern. Kilij Arslan had initially tried negotiation. He sent gifts, offered guides, suggested alternative routes. But Frederick was moving directly toward Iconium, the Sultan's own capital. This wasn't just a passage through Turkish lands. This was a statement the German emperor feared no one. By early May, Kilij Arslan made his decision. He would gather every warrior he could summon and destroy this German army before it could leave Anatolia. He sent word to his sons, to the emirs of the surrounding territories, to every Turkish and Turkmen warrior within reach. They gathered at Iconium, the ancient city the Byzantines had once called Konya. The numbers grew: 10,000, 20,000, 30,000. Some sources claim the Turkish force reached 40 or even 50,000 men. The core of the Turkish army was cavalry, the legendary Turkish horse archers who had terrorized Crusaders for generations. These men were born in the saddle. They could shoot a bow at full gallop with lethal accuracy. Their preferred tactic was to swarm around enemy formations, never quite engaging, simply shooting arrow after arrow until the enemy either broke formation or exhausted their own missile troops. Then, when the Christians were weakened and disorganized, the Turkish heavy cavalry, armed with lances and sabers, would charge home. They also had significant infantry, garrison troops from Iconium itself, militia levies from the surrounding farms, and mercenaries from as far away as Persia. The chroniclers describe the Turkish battle line as a vast crescent, with the infantry in the center holding the gates and walls of Iconium, and the cavalry on the wings, ready to envelop any attacker. Kilij Arslan was confident. He had the numbers, he had the terrain, he had the walls of his capital behind him, and he faced an exhausted Christian army that had been marching for nearly a year. One Turkish source claims the Sultan boasted he would capture Frederick alive and parade him through the streets of Damascus in chains. But he had miscalculated. He had mistaken Frederick's caution for weakness. He didn't understand that this emperor had spent a lifetime learning warfare, that every ambush, every skirmish, every Turkish raid along the march had been a lesson absorbed and prepared for. Frederick hadn't been avoiding battle. He'd been choosing when and where to fight. On May 17, 1190, Frederick's army approached Iconium. The city sat in a fertile valley, watered by mountain streams. Around it, the Turkish army had deployed. The sight must have been stunning and terrifying. 40,000 warriors, their banners snapping in the wind, their armor gleaming, the air filled with the sound of drums and war cries. Frederick called his commanders together. The sources tell us he spoke plainly. They were outnumbered, exhausted, low on supplies. But they had two advantages. First, they were desperate. There was no retreat, no other option. It was victory or death. Second, they had Frederick. The emperor divided his army into two main formations. The vanguard, led by his son Frederick of Swabia, would consist of about 5,000 men, primarily heavy cavalry and mounted sergeants. Their job was to break the Turkish line, to smash through the center and reach the gates of Iconium itself. The main body, under Frederick's personal command, would contain the remaining 10,000 or so fighting men, more knights, the infantry, the crossbowmen and the camp followers, armed with whatever weapons they could carry. Frederick's plan was audacious. He would attack immediately, not tomorrow after rest, not after negotiations, but now, while the Turks were still organizing their forces. He would use the very tactic that had defeated Crusaders before, the feigned retreat, but in reverse. He would charge the Turkish center with everything he had, overwhelming it with shock and weight, then hold the ground while his crossbowmen and infantry came up to support. The Turkish cavalry, masters of mobility, would find themselves fighting a brutal close-quarters battle where their bows were useless and their light armor a liability. But first, there was the river. A tributary of the region's waterways, swollen with spring melt, lay between the German army and Iconium. The Turks held the far bank. Crossing under fire would be suicide for most armies. Frederick didn't hesitate. On the morning of May 18th, he ordered the advance. Young Frederick of Swabia led his knights into the water. The river was chest-deep on the horses. Turkish arrows rained down. Men and horses screamed as arrows found gaps in armor. But the Germans kept coming. The weight of armored knights, even struggling through water, was an elemental force. A German chronicler wrote, "The river ran red with our blood, but not one man turned back. We knew our emperor watched us, and we would die before we shamed him." The vanguard crashed into the Turkish line on the far bank. This was where medieval warfare showed its true face, brutal and personal. Knights swung maces and swords. Horses trampled fallen men. The Turks, expecting the Germans to break under the arrow storm, found themselves facing a wall of steel and fury that wouldn't stop. Young Frederick, 26 years old and fighting to prove himself worthy of his legendary father, was in the thick of it, his sword rising and falling. The Turkish centre buckled. Not broke, not yet, but buckled. The horse archers wheeled away, looking for space to use their bows. That was when Frederick Barbarossa himself entered the battle. The main German force, led by the Emperor on horseback despite his 70 years, plunged into the river. The sight of the Red Emperor, white-bearded now but still massive in his armor, his imperial banner streaming above him, galvanized the German army. What happened next was chaos, the kind of swirling, desperate melee that no chronicler could fully capture. The battle dissolved into dozens of individual fights. Turkish horse archers tried to swarm the German flanks, but found themselves blocked by German crossbowmen who had been trained to fight in mixed formations with the knights. The crossbow was slower than the Turkish composite bow, but it hit harder, punching through armor at close range. When Turkish cavalry got too close, the crossbowmen dropped their weapons and fought with swords and axes. The Turkish infantry, dug in around the city gates, were better equipped for close combat. They had spears, shields, and the advantage of fighting from prepared positions. For a terrible hour, the battle hung in balance. German knights, exhausted from the march and the river crossing, threw themselves against Turkish spearmen who had fresh legs and the desperation of men defending their homes. Some chronicles claim Frederick himself fought in this press, though at 70 we must assume his role was more inspirational than martial. But inspiration mattered. A German knight later wrote, "When we saw the Emperor among us, no longer distant, but beside us in the press, we found strength we didn't know we possessed." It was as though God himself had joined our ranks. The turning point came from an unexpected direction. A group of German infantry, perhaps 500 men armed with spears and axes, found a gap in the Turkish line. These weren't knights but common soldiers, men-at-arms and even armed pilgrims. They poured through the breach and reached the city gates. The gates of Iconium were closed but not fully secured. The defenders, caught between watching the main battle and securing their own walls, had left the gate mechanism vulnerable. What happened next entered legend. A German soldier, his name lost to history though some sources call him Heinrich, scaled the gate tower. Under a hail of arrows and stones, he reached the mechanism and cut the ropes. The gates swung open. German troops poured into Iconium. This was the psychological moment that broke the battle. Turkish soldiers, seeing their capital penetrated, began to waver. The horse archers who had been harrying the German flanks suddenly found themselves threatened from behind. Kilij Arslan, watching from a hilltop, saw his carefully prepared battle plan collapse. He ordered a general retreat. But retreat was easier ordered than executed. The German knights who had been holding formation for hours now smelled victory. They charged. This was what they had trained for their entire lives, the thunderous cavalry charge that could sweep everything before it. Tired as they were, armored knights on war horses were the tanks of the medieval battlefield. Turkish light cavalry caught in the open were ridden down. The rout became a massacre. Turkish sources admit to catastrophic losses, though they naturally minimize the numbers. German chronicles claim 10 to 15,000 Turkish dead. Modern historians are more conservative, suggesting perhaps 5 to 7,000 killed, with many more wounded or captured. But even the conservative numbers represent a devastating defeat. The elite of the Sultanate of Rum's military had been shattered in a single day. Iconium fell completely. The German army poured into the city, and here we must confront the brutal reality of medieval warfare. What followed was not noble. The Germans sacked Iconium, buildings were burned, the population was subjected to the typical horrors of a conquered city. 0000 to 00015 rape, theft and murder occurred, though Frederick tried to maintain some discipline, executing soldiers who went too far and demanding that churches and mosques be left intact where possible. One German chronicle, more honest than most, records, "We had become the very savages we claimed to fight against. The cries of women and children haunted our camp that night, but we told ourselves it was God's will." 015 to 00030. The spoils were immense. Iconium had been a wealthy city, a trading hub on the Silk Road. German soldiers found gold, silk, weapons, food, and most importantly, horses. The army that had been starving and exhausted suddenly had supplies for months. Turkish weapons and armor were distributed among the German troops. The Sultan's own treasury was captured, though Kilij Arslan himself escaped. 030 to 00045, but perhaps the most important prize was psychological. News of the victory at Iconium spread like wildfire. In the remaining Turkish territories, garrisons refused to fight. Local emirs sued for peace and offered guides and supplies. The aura of Turkish invincibility in Anatolia had been shattered. One army, one battle, one day had changed the strategic situation completely. 045 to 010. Frederick remained in Iconium for 5 days, resting his men and organizing the supplies. He negotiated with Turkish envoys, who now came begging for terms. Kilij Arslan, desperate to prevent further devastation, agreed to provide guides, open roads and market access for the German army. In exchange, Frederick would leave Anatolia as quickly as possible and not reduce any more Turkish cities. 000 to 0115, Frederick agreed. He had what he wanted, a clear road to the Holy Land. On May 23rd, the German army marched out of Iconium, now reinforced and resupplied. Ahead lay the Taurus Mountains and then the Armenian Christian kingdoms that would welcome them. Jerusalem seemed within reach. 1:15 to 01, but fate had one final, cruel twist. On June 10, 1190, barely 3 weeks after his greatest victory, Frederick Barbarossa drowned. The circumstances are murky. The German army was crossing the Saleph River in Cilicia, modern-day southern Turkey. The river was shallow, the day hot. Some sources say Frederick, overheated in his armor, decided to bathe and was swept away by an unexpected current. Others suggest he suffered a heart attack in the cold water. A few claim his horse stumbled, throwing him into a deep pool. Exactly 1:45. We'll never know exactly what happened, but the result was catastrophic. The emperor, who had survived a year of brutal marching, countless skirmishes, and the Battle of Iconium itself, died in a minor river crossing. His body was recovered, but the army was shattered psychologically. Without Frederick, there was no binding force. Some German contingents turned back immediately. 1:45 to 020. Others continued to Antioch, where Frederick's body was partially buried, though some sources claim they tried to preserve him in vinegar to reach Jerusalem. Young Frederick of Swabia took command of the remnants and pushed on to Acre, where he joined Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus. But the German contribution to the Third Crusade, which could have been decisive, was reduced to a shadow. 2000 to 0215. The army that had been 20 to 30,000 strong reached the Holy Land with barely 5,000 men. Disease, desertion, and the loss of their charismatic leader had destroyed them as effectively as any battle. And yet, the Battle of Iconium remained significant. It proved that Turkish armies, even on their home ground, could be defeated by well-led, disciplined European forces. 2:15 to 0230, it opened Anatolia to future crusading armies, including later German Crusades. It enhanced the legendary status of Frederick Barbarossa, ensuring he would be remembered not as a drowned old man, but as the emperor who crushed 40,000 Turks in a single day. The impact on the Turkish world was profound. The Sultanate of Rum never fully recovered its prestige. 2:30 to 0245, Kilij Arslan died the following year, and his sultanate fragmented among his sons. The defeat at Iconium contributed to a period of Turkish weakness in Anatolia that lasted decades. It also affected Saladin's strategic calculations. He had been expecting to face 3 large crusading armies. When the German force arrived decimated, it allowed him to concentrate his forces against Richard and Philip, though even then, he couldn't prevent the loss of the coastal cities. 2:45-030. In Europe, Frederick became a legend. Stories spread that he wasn't really dead, that he slept in a cavern beneath the Kyffhauser mountain in Germany, waiting to return when his empire needed him. This myth of the sleeping emperor persisted for centuries, blending with earlier legends of Charlemagne. Even in the 19th century, German nationalists invoked Barbarossa as a symbol of German unity and power. 3000-0315. But beyond the legends and the myths, what really happened at Iconium? How did a 70-year-old emperor with barely 15,000 exhausted men defeat a Turkish army nearly 3 times that size in a single day? The answer lies in a combination of factors that military historians still study. First, leadership. Frederick's personal example was everything. 3:15-0330. Medieval armies fought for their leaders, and a charismatic commander could inspire men to superhuman efforts. Frederick had spent a year proving himself to his troops, sharing their hardships, demonstrating his tactical skill in dozens of skirmishes. When he ordered them into the river under fire, they went because it was Frederick Barbarossa asking. 3:03:45. Second, discipline. The German army was the most professional force in Europe. Frederick had imposed strict organization, trained his men in combined arms tactics, and enforced consequences for breaking formation or orders. When Turkish horse archers tried to draw the Germans out of formation, the Germans held. That discipline, learned through painful experience, made them far more effective than their numbers suggested. 3:45-040. Third, equipment. The German knights were more heavily armored than their Turkish opponents. Turkish composite bows were deadly, but they struggled to penetrate the mail and plate armor worn by German knights. At close range, a fully armored knight with a mace or sword was nearly invincible against lightly armored Turkish cavalry. The battle at Iconium became a close-quarters affair, exactly where the Germans had the advantage. 4:000-0415. Fourth, desperation. The German army had no other option. They were deep in enemy territory, running out of supplies, with no chance of retreat. It was victory or death. That kind of existential pressure creates ferocious fighters. The Turks, defending their capital, should have had similar motivation, but they also had the option of retreating behind the city walls and waiting for the Germans to exhaust themselves. 4:15-0430. That split focus between defending and preserving their forces may have cost them the battle. Finally, the river crossing. It seems counterintuitive that crossing a river under fire could be an advantage, but it was. The Turks expected the Germans to be disorganized and vulnerable after the crossing, easy targets for their horse archers. Instead, the Germans came across in tight formation, already committed to close combat. 4:30-0445. The Turks found themselves in a battle they didn't want, and by the time they realized their mistake, the German knights were among them. One chronicle captures the moment perfectly. The Turks expected a target. They got a hammer. The human cost is harder to quantify. The Turkish sources written later, and often with a desire to minimize the disaster, give few details. 4:45-050. We know thousands died, but we don't know their names or stories. We know Iconium was sacked, but we don't know how many civilians suffered. Medieval warfare was brutal in ways we can barely imagine, and both sides committed atrocities that modern sensibilities find horrifying. On the German side, we have more details, but they're filtered through the lens of propaganda. The chronicles were written to glorify Frederick and the Crusade, so they emphasize heroism and divine favor while minimizing the chaos and terror of actual combat. But occasionally, honest details slip through. The exhaustion, the terror of the river crossing, the smell of blood and death, the nightmares afterward. One soldier, writing years later, admitted, "I can still hear the screams when I close my eyes. Turkish and German, it all sounded the same. I think I killed 3 men that day, though in the press it was hard to be sure." I pray for them sometimes, even though they were infidels. We were all just men trying not to die. That honesty is rare in medieval chronicles, but it reminds us that behind the grand strategy and the epic narrative were thousands of individuals, scared and tired and fighting because they had no choice. The battle's legacy extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. It became a touchstone for later generations. When German Crusaders marched east in later decades, they invoked Iconium as proof that faith and discipline could overcome any odds. When Turkish writers discussed the Crusades, Iconium remained a cautionary tale about underestimating the Franks. When military theorists analyzed medieval warfare, Iconium became an example of how combined arms tactics and aggressive leadership could defeat numerically superior forces. Even today, military historians study the battle, the logistics of moving a large medieval army through hostile territory, the psychology of command, and the importance of personal leadership. The tactical innovations that allowed heavily armored cavalry to function effectively in the Anatolian climate. The interplay between different types of troops, knights, infantry, crossbowmen, horse archers. All of these elements came together at Iconium in a way that reveals the complexity of medieval warfare. But perhaps the most important lesson of Iconium is about the fragility of historical memory. If Frederick hadn't drowned 3 weeks later, if he had reached Jerusalem and completed his crusade, Iconium would be remembered as one of the turning points of the Crusades. Instead, it became a footnote, overshadowed by Frederick's death and Richard's later campaigns. History, it turns out, is written not just by the victors, but by those who survived to write it. The soldiers who fought at Iconium didn't know they were participating in a nearly forgotten battle. They thought they were making history. In their letters home, in their stories told around campfires, they believed they were part of something that would be remembered forever. And for a time, they were right. For a generation or two, every German knight knew about Iconium. But as the years passed, as the Crusades failed and the enthusiasm for holy war waned, the stories faded. Now, more than 800 years later, we can look back and see Iconium for what it was, a remarkable military achievement, a day when an aging emperor and an exhausted army accomplished something that shouldn't have been possible. It wasn't the clean, glorious victory that the chronicles wanted to portray. It was messy, brutal, and morally complicated. But it was real and it mattered. Frederick Barbarossa died pursuing a dream that was already fading, a medieval world of clear moral lines and divine mandate that was giving way to something more complex. But on May 18, 1190, he had one last moment of absolute clarity, an emperor, an army, an enemy, and a battle to win. And win it he did in just one day, against odds that seemed impossible. That's not legend, that's history. The Battle of Iconium stands as a testament to what leadership, discipline, and determination can achieve even in the most desperate circumstances. Frederick Barbarossa's victory demonstrated that careful preparation, tactical innovation, and personal courage could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. The battle showed that the supposedly invincible Turkish cavalry could be defeated when faced with a well-organized, heavily armored force that refused to break formation or lose its nerve. The tragedy of Frederick's death just weeks after his greatest triumph reminds us how fragile success can be in medieval warfare. The same rivers and terrain that the Germans had navigated so carefully for a year ultimately claimed their emperor in the most mundane of circumstances. It's a stark reminder that in the medieval world, death could come as easily from accident as from battle, and that even the most careful planning couldn't account for every danger. For the Third Crusade, Frederick's death was a catastrophe that arguably changed its entire outcome. Had the full German army reached the Holy Land intact, and under Frederick's leadership, the balance of power might have shifted dramatically. Saladin would have faced not just Richard and Philip, but a third major army led by Europe's most experienced military commander. Instead, the German contribution was reduced to a remnant, and the Crusades' achievements were limited to retaking coastal cities rather than Jerusalem itself. The Battle of Iconium thus occupies a unique place in crusading history, a stunning tactical victory that proved strategically meaningless because of one man's untimely death. It reminds us that in medieval warfare, as in all human endeavors, individual lives mattered enormously. The loss of one charismatic leader could undo the work of thousands and change the course of history in ways that no amount of planning or preparation could prevent.